On August 12, 1985, an amateur photographer standing on the ground in Japan took a photo of an airplane high in the sky. It was a massive Boeing 747. But when you look closely at the photo, you realize something is terribly wrong. The entire tail section of the airplane is completely gone. At the exact moment that photo was taken, there were 524 people on board that plane. They were flying at 24,000 feet, moving at hundreds of miles per hour. According to every computer simulation ever run, an airplane without a tail should have fallen out of the sky immediately. It should have been over in seconds. Instead, for 32 terrifying minutes, 3 men in the cockpit fought the most desperate battle in aviation history. They flew an unflyable airplane using nothing but raw engine power and a refusal to give up. This is the story of Japan Airlines Flight 123. It is a disaster that shocked the world, not just because of how it ended, but because of a hidden mistake made 7 years before the plane ever took off. August 12th is a very busy day in Japan. It is the start of the Obon holiday, a time when millions of people travel from big cities back to their hometowns to visit family. Because of this, Tokyo's Haneda Airport was packed with people. Flight 123 was a short domestic flight from Tokyo to Osaka. The trip usually takes only 50 minutes. To handle the massive crowd, Japan Airlines used a special version of the Boeing 747 called the short-range model. This plane was built like a flying bus, packed with extra seats to hold as many people as possible. On this evening, the plane was completely full. There were 509 passengers and 15 crew members on board. Among them were many families, young children, and a famous Japanese singer named Kyu Sakamoto. In the cockpit was a highly experienced crew. The captain was Masami Takahama. He was a veteran pilot with over 12,000 hours of flying experience. On this flight, he was sitting in the right seat to monitor his young co-pilot, Yutaka Sasaki, who was training to become a full captain. Behind them sat the flight engineer, Hiroshi Fukuda, a man who knew every mechanical part of the plane. At 6:12 p.m., the giant aircraft took off into a beautiful, clear sunset. The takeoff was perfect. The plane climbed smoothly over Tokyo Bay and turned toward its destination. To the passengers, it felt like a normal, safe flight. But hiding in the very back of the plane, just behind the last row of seats, a fatal weakness was waiting to rip the aircraft apart. 12 minutes into the flight, as the plane reached 24,000 feet, a loud explosion rocked the aircraft. In an instant, the ceiling panels in the back of the cabin collapsed. The air turned into a thick white fog because all the pressurized air inside the cabin suddenly rushed out into the thin sky. Oxygen masks dropped down in front of the passengers. In the cockpit, the pilots felt a violent jolt. Alarms started ringing. The pilots initially thought a landing gear door had broken off. But within seconds, the flight engineer looked at his panels and delivered terrifying news. All hydraulic pressure was dropping to zero. To understand how bad this was, you need to know how a Boeing 747 flies. A 747 is massive and weighs over 300 tons. A human pilot is not strong enough to move the wing flaps or the tail controls by muscle power alone. Instead, when a pilot moves the control wheel, it uses hydraulic fluid under pressure to push the heavy parts, just like power steering in a car. The 747 was designed with 4 independent hydraulic systems. Even if 3 systems failed, the plane could fly perfectly on just one. It was supposed to be completely safe. But within 90 seconds of the explosion, all 4 hydraulic systems were empty. The fluid had leaked out into the sky. The pilots turned their control wheels, but nothing happened. The steering wheel was loose in their hands. The plane was completely out of control. Without a tail fin to keep it straight and without hydraulics to move the wings, the 747 began to move like a roller coaster. It entered a motion called a phugoid cycle. The plane would pitch up sharply, lose speed, stall, and then plunge toward the earth. As it dove down, it would gain speed, which caused the nose to pitch up violently again. Up and down, over and over, the plane swung through the sky. At the same time, the plane began to rock violently from side to side. The pilots realized they had only one tool left to steer the plane, the engines. By increasing power to the left engines and decreasing power to the right, they could force the plane to turn right. By pushing the throttles forward on all engines, they could use speed to lift the nose. By cutting power, they could make the nose go down. Imagine trying to steer a speeding car on a busy highway using only your gas pedal and your brakes, without touching the steering wheel. That is what these 3 men had to do with a giant jumbo jet. The captain called air traffic control in Tokyo. He declared an emergency and asked to return to the airport. Air traffic control cleared all other planes out of the way. They told Flight 123 they could land at Tokyo or at a nearby US military base called Yokota Air Base. But the captain could not take their advice. He could not steer the plane where he wanted it to go. The wind was blowing the helpless aircraft directly toward the highest, most dangerous mountains in Japan. Inside the cabin, the flight attendants acted with incredible bravery. Even though the plane was rocking violently and everyone was terrified, they walked down the aisles to help passengers put on their oxygen masks. They made sure everyone was buckled in tightly and showed them how to tuck into the brace position for a crash landing. Realizing they might not survive, many passengers pulled out pens and paper. With shaking hands, they wrote goodbye notes to their families. One father wrote a note to his children telling them to look after their mother, stating that he was grateful for the happy life he had lived. In the cockpit, the struggle was exhausting. The pilots were physically wrestling with the controls, using all their muscle strength even though they knew the steering wheels were disconnected. Their clothes were soaked in sweat. The flight engineer then had a desperate idea. He suggested lowering the landing gear using the emergency gravity system. He hoped that dropping the heavy wheels into the wind would create drag and help slow down the wild rollercoaster motion. At 6:47 p.m., they dropped the landing gear. It actually helped. The plane became a bit more stable, and for a moment, there was hope. The pilots managed to turn the plane back toward Tokyo. But their luck did not last. As they got lower, the air became thicker, causing the plane to dive rapidly at 3,000 feet per minute. Directly in front of them were the sharp peaks of the mountains. The final minutes of the flight were chaotic. The crew was completely exhausted after fighting the plane for half an hour. The aircraft entered a deep mountain valley, with mountain walls rising on both sides of the windows. The plane's automatic ground warning system began screaming, "Pull up! Pull up!" The captain yelled to increase power to maximum, but the heavy plane responded too slowly. At 6:56 p.m., the right wing clipped the trees on a mountain ridge. The impact ripped part of the wing off and flipped the plane upside down. Moving at 350 miles per hour, Japan Airlines Flight 123 crashed into the side of Mount Takamagahara. A massive explosion lit up the dark sky, and then there was complete silence in the mountains. When the sun came up the next morning, rescue teams looked at the crash site from helicopters. It was a scene of total destruction. The plane had broken into thousands of pieces scattered across the forest. Because the crash happened in a remote area and because of bureaucratic delays, rescue teams did not actually reach the site until 14 hours after the crash. Everyone assumed there would be 0 survivors from such a terrible impact. But as rescuers climbed through the wreckage, they found a miracle. 4 people, all women who had been sitting in the very back rows of the plane, were alive. They had survived the crash because the tail section broke away from the main impact. Among the survivors was an off-duty flight attendant, a mother with her 8-year-old daughter, and a 12-year-old girl who was found stuck in the branches of a tree. Later, doctors discovered a tragic truth. Many more people had survived the initial crash but died during the 14 cold hours spent waiting for help. This caused massive public anger in Japan. The public demanded to know why the tail had blown off in the first place. Investigators from Japan and the United States began looking into the history of the specific airplane. They discovered that 7 years earlier, in 1978, this exact plane had a bad landing at Osaka Airport. The pilot had pulled up too high, and the bottom of the tail scraped hard against the runway. This damaged the rear pressure bulkhead, which is the strong metal wall that keeps the pressurized air inside the passenger cabin separate from the unpressurized tail. Boeing engineers were brought in to fix it. The repair manual stated that they needed to use a single, solid metal plate to cover the damage, secured by 3 rows of rivets to hold the immense pressure. Instead, the workers made a terrible mistake. They cut the metal plate into 2 separate pieces to make it fit. This meant that instead of 3 rows of rivets sharing the load, a single row of rivets was forced to hold all the pressure every time the plane took off and landed. Boeing later calculated that this bad repair would hold for about 10,000 flights before breaking. On August 12, 1985, Flight 123 was on its 12,319th flight since that repair. The metal had simply grown tired. The single row of rivets snapped, the wall tore open, and the pressurized air rushed into the tail like a bomb, blowing the entire tail fin off the plane and cutting the hydraulic lines. The disaster changed aviation forever. The president of Japan Airlines resigned, and a chief maintenance manager took his own life to apologize to the families. Boeing accepted full blame and changed its repair rules worldwide. Today, commercial flying is much safer because of Flight 123. Inspections on these hidden walls are incredibly strict, and modern planes are designed so that even a total tail failure cannot drain the steering fluid. Beyond the technical changes, Flight 123 is remembered for the incredible bravery of its crew. The 3 men in the cockpit were given an impossible situation. They knew the danger they were in, but they never stopped fighting. For 32 minutes, they worked together to keep 524 people alive for as long as humanly possible, leaving behind a legacy of absolute dedication and courage.